Commander Kethvar had witnessed many species face their mortality. The Altarians wept crystalline tears. The Vorthans sang their death songs. The Keplerians simply closed their 6 eyes and accepted fate with dignified silence. And humans, apparently, cracked jokes. Dr. Veltan, Kethvar said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered 17 star systems, please repeat your findings for the record. The chief medical officer's tentacles twitched nervously as she consulted her bioscanner. Her usual confident demeanor had cracked somewhere between the 3rd impossible reading and the patient's casual request for snacks. Commander, the human designated as Captain Maya Santos presents with, well, everything wrong, frankly. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what passed for Zephyrian impatience. A elaborate a catastrophic internal hemorrhaging in 4 major organ clusters. Radiation poisoning at levels that should have liquefied her cellular structure 6 hours ago. Her skeletal system has more fractures than solid bone. Her cardiovascular network is operating at 37% capacity. Veltan paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Commander, her brain is literally swelling against her skull, and yet she keeps asking if we have any of those little crackers they serve on passenger transports. The human in question lay strapped to the medical platform, looking like she had been put through a particle accelerator and then asked to critique the experience. Her skin had taken on an unhealthy grayish pallor, punctuated by burns that formed abstract patterns across her arms and torso. Blood seeped through the biofoam patches covering dozens of wounds, and she was smiling. Not the peaceful smile of acceptance that Kethvar had seen on dying prisoners before. This was the smile of someone who had just figured out the punchline to a joke that nobody else had heard yet. So, Dr. Maya said, her voice hoarse but steady, what are my odds here? Give it to me straight. I can handle bad news. I once got a performance review from Admiral Jackson, and that man could crush dreams with a semicolon. Veltan's tentacles curled tighter around her scanner. Captain Santos, your survival probability is 2%. I am truly sorry. Kethvar expected tears. Perhaps bargaining. Maybe the usual human tendency toward irrational hope that made them such frustrating opponents. Instead, Maya's grin widened. 2%? She actually laughed, a sound that should have been impossible given her collapsed lung. Well, that's just fantastic. Really, truly fantastic. I do not understand your reaction, human, Veltan said. Maya turned her head, fixing Kethvar with eyes that should have been dimming but instead sparkled with something that made his combat instincts twitch. Commander, right? Tell me something. If I've got a 2% chance of living, what exactly am I supposed to do with the other 98%? What happened next violated every principle of xenobiology that Kethvar had learned in his 2 centuries of military service. Dr. Veltan, Maya said, waving away the neural sedative injection with a hand that should have been too weak to lift. And before you pump me full of whatever passes for morphine in your culture, I've got some questions. Captain Santos, you need immediate medical intervention, Veltan protested, her tentacles practically vibrating with professional concern. Our bioregeneration matrix can stabilize your cellular degradation, but only if we begin treatment within the next. Yeah, stabilization, got it. Maya interrupted with the casual dismissal of someone declining a dinner invitation rather than life-saving medical care. But see, I'm what you might call a curious type. It's a human thing. We like to understand our surroundings before we, die horribly. Kethvar's secondary brain, the one responsible for tactical analysis, began sending warning signals. Something was wrong with this scenario. Dying prisoners did not conduct interviews, for instance. Maya continued, somehow propping herself up on her elbows despite having 3 broken ribs, this medical bay. Nice setup you've got here. Those power conduits running along the ceiling, they feed directly into your main grid. Right? And that's your primary life support distribution hub in the corner there. Clever design. Very accessible. Dr. Veltan blinked her large, compound eyes in confusion. Ah yes, but why would you? Oh, Just optimizing my remaining time, Doc. 2% survival means I've got, what, maybe 18 hours? 20 if I'm lucky. Maya's grin never wavered. Seems wasteful to spend it all unconscious, don't you think? The human is clearly delirious, Veltan whispered to Kethvar. Acute neurological trauma often causes patients to fixate on irrelevant details. But Kethvar was beginning to suspect that Maya Santos had never been more lucid in her life. Her eyes tracked every movement in the medical bay, cataloging equipment, personnel, and procedures with the systematic precision of a military intelligence officer. Which, he realized with growing unease, she probably was. "Doctor, humor me for a moment," Maya said, somehow managing to sit up fully despite injuries that should have left her paralyzed. "Your species evolved on a low-gravity world, right? That's why your bones are so elegantly thin. Beautiful, really, like living art pieces." Veltan preened slightly at the compliment, her tentacles relaxing. "Yes, Zephyr Prime has only 0.7 standard gravity. Our physiology adapted for grace and efficiency, rather than brute strength." "Fascinating. And your cardiovascular system, it's distributed throughout those lovely tentacles, isn't it? No central heart like us primitive humans. Much more elegant." Maya's tone was genuinely appreciative, as if she were discussing fine wine rather than alien anatomy. "I bet that makes you incredibly resilient to certain types of trauma." "Indeed. We are quite proud of our evolutionary advantages, and quite vulnerable to others, I'd imagine." The temperature in the medical bay seemed to drop several degrees. Kethvar stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "What exactly are you implying, human?" Maya looked up at him with eyes that were far too alert for someone supposedly dying. "Oh, nothing sinister, Commander. Just making conversation. After all, when you've only got a 2% chance of survival, you tend to notice things about the other 98% of reality." She gestured weakly toward the medical equipment surrounding her, like how your bioscanners use the same frequency as your internal communications. Or how your gravity generators have that cute little fluctuation every 47 seconds. Or how your security protocols assume that prisoners will be, actually incapacitated. "The human requires immediate sedation," Kethvar said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably," Maya agreed cheerfully. "But here's the thing about us Deathworlders, Commander. We have this really annoying habit of staying awake when we should be sleeping." Over the next 3 hours, Kethvar watched Maya Santos conduct what could only be described as the galaxy's most casual military intelligence operation. "You know what's really impressive about this ship?" Maya said, accepting a nutrient drip that she definitely should not have been conscious enough to request. "The engineering. I mean, whoever designed your plasma distribution network was either a genius or completely insane." Chief Engineer Nix Allen, who had been summoned to repair a supposedly malfunctioning bioscanner, froze in the doorway. His forearms, which had been efficiently manipulating tools moments before, suddenly seemed awkward and conspicuous. "I beg your pardon?" Nix Allen's voice carried the tremor of someone who had spent years perfecting their craft, only to have it casually insulted by a dying alien. "Oh, don't get me wrong," Maya said, somehow managing to gesture despite the restraints. "Running your primary plasma conduits directly through the recreational areas? That's bold. Really bold. I mean, sure, if there's ever a containment breach, half your crew gets vaporized while playing their equivalent of chess, but think of the space savings." Kethvar's mandibles clicked nervously. "The human is experiencing cognitive dysfunction." Ignore her rambling. "Rambling?" Maya's laugh sounded genuinely delighted. "Commander, I'm giving your engineering team a free consultation here. Do you know how much human military advisors charge per hour? Although, to be fair, most of our clients are still alive when we present our findings." Nix Allen's arms twitched. "Our plasma distribution system is the most efficient design in the quadrant. It has operated flawlessly for over 60 standard years." 60 years? Wow. That's really something. Maya's tone was so sincere that it took several seconds for the implied criticism to sink in. I bet your maintenance crews have gotten really good at working in hazardous environments. Out of necessity, you understand. There is nothing hazardous about our maintenance protocols, Nix Allen protested, though his defensive posture suggested otherwise. Of course not. I'm sure your safety record is exemplary. Maya paused, as if a thought had just occurred to her. Although, quick question, when your artificial gravity generators experience those little fluctuations, do your plasma conduits always rattle like that? Because from where I'm lying, it sounds like they're trying to shake themselves loose from their mounting brackets. The color drained from Nix Allen's face, or at least the Zephyrian equivalent of draining color, which involved his skin shifting from deep purple to a sickly lavender. How could you possibly know about the gravity fluctuations? Kethvar demanded. Maya shrugged, a gesture that should have been impossible given her spinal injuries. Like I said, we Deathworlders notice things. For instance, every 47 seconds, there's a tiny vibration in the deck plating. Most species probably wouldn't feel it, but humans evolved on a world where noticing small changes meant the difference between eating dinner and becoming dinner. Dr. Veltan, who had been monitoring Maya's vital signs with increasing bewilderment, spoke up. Commander, her neurological activity is unprecedented. Despite massive trauma to her cranial region, her cognitive function appears to be accelerating. Accelerating? Maya grinned. Doc, you flatter me. I'm just making conversation. For example, Chief Engineer, I'm curious about your emergency protocols. They seem designed for crew members with 4 arms, which is great for your species. But what happens if you have visitors, or prisoners, or, hypothetically speaking, saboteurs who only have 2 arms but really good spatial reasoning skills? Nix Allen's forearms began making small, agitated gestures. Our emergency systems are universally accessible. Sure they are. That's why all your manual overrides are positioned at the exact height and spacing for 4-armed operation. And your evacuation procedures assume everyone can manipulate 4 separate controls simultaneously. Maya's voice remained conversational, but her eyes had taken on the focused intensity of a predator. Not criticizing, mind you. Just observing that your security measures might have some gaps. The human is conducting reconnaissance, Kethvar realized aloud, his combat training finally overriding his confusion. Reconnaissance. Maya looked genuinely hurt. Commander, I'm dying. What am I going to do with military intelligence? Mail it to my next of kin? I'm just trying to understand the impressive technology that's going to be the last thing I ever see. But even as she spoke, her eyes continued their systematic cataloging of every system, every vulnerability, every design flaw that 60 years of successful operation had taught the Zephyrians to ignore. Besides, Maya added with that unsettling smile, I've only got a 2% chance of surviving this encounter. What possible threat could I pose to a ship full of superior beings with their flawlessly designed technology? The question hung in the air like plasma waiting to breach containment. Kethvar should have realized something was wrong when Maya asked for a second pillow. Not because dying prisoners typically cared about comfort, but because she had specifically requested the biofoam cushion from the supply cabinet nearest the primary communications relay. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable request from someone spending her final hours in a medical bay. Now, 6 hours later, as soft electronic chirping emanated from somewhere behind Maya's head, Kethvar understood that he had been monumentally, catastrophically naive. Dr. Veltan, he said, his voice carrying the calm tone that preceded either promotions or executions, please explain why our supposedly dying prisoner appears to be conducting a communications conference. Veltan's tentacles performed what could only be described as a panicked dance around her scanner. Commander, the biofoam cushion contains standard medical monitoring sensors. There should be no way to. Hello, Nova Squadron, this is Saber 7. Maya's voice carried clearly across the medical bay, though she appeared to be speaking into her pillow. I'm currently enjoying the hospitality of our Zephyrian friends, and I thought you might like to know about their fascinating fleet deployment. Kethvar's primary and secondary brains simultaneously experienced what humans might call a mental blue screen of death. Captain Santos, he said, drawing his sidearm with practiced efficiency, explain how you are transmitting communications while restrained in a secure medical facility. Maya turned her head, and for the first time since her capture, her expression showed genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, Commander, you're going to love this. Remember when I mentioned that your bioscanners use the same frequency as your internal communications? Well, it turns out that your medical monitoring sensors are basically tiny transmitters just waiting for someone to reconfigure them." She gestured weakly at the pillow, which Kethvar now realized had been systematically disassembled and rewired using medical tubing, sensor leads, and what appeared to be components from her own uniform. A few modifications, some creative signal routing through your ship's own communication array, and voila, instant subspace transmitter. Nova Squadron, target designation Tango 7, is a destroyer-class vessel, approximately 800 meters in length. Primary armament consists of 12 heavy plasma cannons with a charging cycle of roughly 43 seconds. Their targeting sensors have a notable blind spot approximately 15 degrees off their starboard ventral quadrant. "Impossible," Nix Allen whispered. "She would need detailed technical specifications, system access codes, and engineering schematics?" Maya's grin widened. "Funny story about that. Turns out when you've been unconscious for 6 hours, people tend to forget you're listening. Your maintenance crews have very informative conversations. Also, Chief Engineer, you might want to talk to Technician Velmoth about operational security. He's very chatty when he thinks nobody important is around." Kethvar's weapon remained trained on Maya, though he was beginning to understand that shooting her would accomplish nothing. The damage was already done. Fleet positioning 7 destroyer-class vessels in standard defensive formation. With the command ship positioned at coordinates let me see bearing 27 Mark IV relative to the nearest star. Their standard engagement protocol involves a pincer movement designed to exploit enemy ships with limited maneuverability. "This is impossible," Veltan said, her voice barely a whisper. Her injuries should have rendered her unconscious hours ago. The neural trauma alone. "Doc, here's the thing about humans," Maya said, her voice growing weaker but her eyes remaining sharp as laser cutters. "We evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill us. Our brains developed some interesting redundancies. When the primary systems start shutting down, the backup systems don't just maintain basic functions. They hyperactivate." "You mean?" Kethvar couldn't finish the thought. "I mean that your 2% survival estimate wasn't a death sentence, Commander. It was an operational window." Maya's breathing was becoming labored, but her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just completed a masterpiece. "See, humans have this weird quirk. When we're dying, we don't get weaker. We get desperate. And desperate humans are the most dangerous force in the known galaxy. Nova Squadron, be advised that Zephyrian shield generators have a cyclic vulnerability every 96 seconds. Their regeneration matrix requires a brief power reallocation that drops shield strength by approximately 30%. Also, their artificial gravity fluctuations aren't just a design flaw. They're a critical system weakness that affects weapon targeting accuracy." Kethvar stared at the human who had spent the last 6 hours systematically dismantling centuries of Zephyrian military doctrine while supposedly bleeding to death on a medical table. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what, Commander? How long have you been planning this?" Maya's laugh was soft but genuine. "Planning? Oh, Commander, you give me way too much credit. I've been improvising since the moment your medical scanner told me I had a 2% chance of survival. Everything after that has just been optimization." The medical bay's emergency lighting suddenly flickered, and Kethvar realized that Maya Santos had just weaponized her own death into the most devastating intelligence breach in galactic history. "Nova Squadron, this is Saber 7 signing off. Package delivered. Time to collect." The first human ships materialized out of hyperspace at precisely the moment Dr. Veltan's scanners indicated that Maya Santos should have been entering final cardiac arrest. Instead, she was sitting upright, somehow having converted the medical bay's life support systems into what appeared to be a personal combat enhancement suite. "Commander," Veltan said, her voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire understanding of biology had just been fed through a particle accelerator. "According to every medical principle I know, this human should be dead. Not just unconscious, not just dying. Actually, clinically, irreversibly dead." Kethvar stared at Maya, who had somehow jury-rigged intravenous tubes into a makeshift exoskeleton that was keeping her upright through what could only be described as mechanical stubbornness. Then explain why she appears to be upgrading herself. "Well," Maya said, her voice stronger than it had been in hours despite the fact that her skin had taken on the color of old metal, "turns out your medical equipment is really good at keeping things alive, even things that don't particularly want to be kept alive. I just had to convince it that alive and functional were negotiable terms." She gestured at the web of medical tubing and sensor cables that now surrounded her like a technological cocoon. "Your bioregeneration matrix? Fantastic for cellular repair. Your neural stimulators? Perfect for overriding inconvenient pain signals. Your cardiovascular support system? Well, let's just say it's much more versatile than your engineers intended." The ship shuddered as the first human weapons impacted their shields. "Impossible," Nix Allen whispered, staring at his engineering readouts. "Our defensive systems are responding perfectly. We should be able to repel this attack indefinitely." "Should be," Maya agreed pleasantly. "Except for those tiny modifications I mentioned earlier. You know, the ones I made while everyone assumed I was too busy dying to pay attention to your infrastructure." As if summoned by her words, the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, sending unsecured equipment floating briefly toward the ceiling before crashing back down. The lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. "What did you do?" Kethvar demanded. "Oh, nothing dramatic. Just reprogrammed your gravity generators to amplify their existing fluctuation pattern and rerouted some power conduits, and maybe convinced your targeting computers that up and down are more like suggestions than absolute directions." Maya's grin widened as another series of impacts shook the ship. "Turns out that when you've got a 2% survival chance, you stop worrying about warranty violations." Dr. Veltan's scanner beeped frantically. "Commander, her neural activity is I don't have words for what her neural activity is doing. It's as if her brain is running on pure determination and spite." "That's not inaccurate," Maya said. "See, here's what your xenobiology textbooks probably didn't mention about humans. We don't actually follow standard biological rules when we're cornered. Our bodies have this really inconvenient habit of deciding that normal limitations are optional." She struggled to her feet, supported by a framework of medical equipment that should have been keeping her sedated and stable. Instead, it was apparently providing structural integrity to a human who was refusing to acknowledge that physics applied to her. Most species, when they're dying, focus their remaining energy on preserving core functions. Humans? We focus our energy on making sure that whatever's killing us doesn't get to enjoy the victory. Maya took a shaky step forward, trailing medical cables like technological intestines. "It's a evolutionary quirk. Probably comes from spending a few million years as prey animals who occasionally got tired of running." The ship's main lights failed, replaced by emergency illumination that cast everything in an ominous red glow. "You sabotaged our primary power grid," Kethvar said. "It wasn't a question. I optimized your power distribution for alternative applications," Maya corrected. "For instance, instead of wasting energy on unnecessary systems like structural integrity and life support for non-essential areas, I redirected it to more important functions. Like keeping me conscious long enough to finish this conversation." Another impact, stronger this time. Through the medical bay's viewport, Kethvar could see human ships moving with impossible precision, exploiting weaknesses in Zephyrian formations that should have taken months of analysis to identify. "This was never about survival, was it?" he asked quietly. Maya's expression grew serious for the first time since her capture. "Commander, survival is a luxury. I'm a military engineer attached to a deep reconnaissance unit. My job isn't to survive impossible situations. My job is to make sure impossible situations become possible victories." She gestured at the chaos around them, the failing systems, the perfectly coordinated human attack that was dismantling Zephyrian defenses with surgical precision. "Your medical team gave me a 2% chance of living through this encounter. But they forgot to calculate the probability that I'd make those remaining hours count." The ship's communication system crackled to life with surrender requests from other Zephyrian vessels. "You see, Commander, humans don't just adapt to hostile environments. We weaponize them. You put a dying human in your most secure medical facility, surrounded by your most advanced technology, attended by your most compassionate caregivers." Maya's smile returned, sharp as a blade. "And I turned all of that kindness into the most devastating reconnaissance and sabotage operation in galactic history. Your people underestimated us," Kethvar said. "No," Maya replied, her voice growing faint as her makeshift life support systems finally began to fail. "Your people made the mistake of thinking that a 2% survival chance meant I only had 2% of my capabilities left." She swayed, supported now only by willpower and medical tubing. "Turns out, when humans are down to our last 2%, that's when we become 100% dangerous." The medical bay fell silent, except for the distant sounds of surrender negotiations and the quiet hum of equipment that was keeping a dead woman functional long enough to witness her victory. Admiral Quinn Tar's voice crackled through the emergency communications channel, carrying the weight of a military leader who had just watched centuries of tactical doctrine crumble in the span of 6 hours. "Commander Kethvar, report. How did a single dying prisoner orchestrate the complete collapse of our defensive perimeter?" Kethvar looked at Maya Santos, who was now more medical equipment than human but somehow still conscious, still smiling, still radiating that unsettling satisfaction of someone who had just rewritten the rules of warfare while technically being dead. "Admiral," he said slowly, "I believe we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human lethality." "Explain." Kethvar's mandibles clicked as he searched for words to describe what he had witnessed. "Sir, we have always assumed that humans are dangerous because they are difficult to kill. This assessment was incomplete. Through the viewport, another Zephyrian cruiser's surrender beacon began flashing. The human fleet moved through their formations like predators who had been handed a detailed map of every weakness, every blind spot, every critical vulnerability. "The human is not dangerous because she refuses to die, Admiral. She is dangerous because she refuses to waste her death." Maya's laugh was barely audible, more of a wheeze filtered through mechanical breathing apparatus, but it carried genuine amusement. "Commander, you're starting to understand. Most species treat dying as an ending. Humans treat it as a deadline." "Continue your report, Commander." The Admiral's voice carried an edge of impatience that barely concealed growing panic. Admiral Captain Santos could have spent her final hours in peace. She could have accepted our medical treatment, allowed our compassion to ease her suffering, and died with dignity among beings who bore her no personal malice. Kethvar paused, watching as Maya somehow managed to extract one final data chip from the medical equipment she had converted into her personal war machine. Instead, she weaponized our mercy. The ship shuddered as another section of their fleet transmitted surrender codes. Human vessels were already moving into position to accept prisoners and salvage what remained of Zephyrian military pride. Captain Santos turned our most advanced medical facility into a reconnaissance center, our healing technology into life support for a sabotage operation, and our own humanitarian instincts into tactical advantages. Kethvar's voice carried the tone of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about warfare was catastrophically wrong. "She didn't survive the unsurvivable, Admiral. She maximized the unsurvivable." Maya's vital signs flatlined on Dr. Veltan's scanner, but somehow she remained conscious, supported entirely by machinery that was keeping her brain functional through what could only be described as technological necromancy. The Deathworld designation was misleading, Kethvar continued. We assumed it meant humans were adapted to survive hostile environments. The truth is more terrifying. Humans don't adapt to hostility. They weaponize it. Commander, what are you saying? Kethvar looked at Maya, who was now technically dead but still managing to coordinate final data transfers to the human fleet through equipment she had jury-rigged while bleeding out on a medical table. I am saying, Admiral, that we told this human she had a 2% chance of survival, and she asked what to do with the other 98%. We thought she was being irrational. We were wrong. She was conducting a cost-benefit analysis. The human fleet's flagship opened a communication channel, and a voice that sounded remarkably similar to Maya's came through with crisp military efficiency. Zephyrian fleet, this is Admiral Santos of the Human Expeditionary Force. You are outgunned, outmaneuvered, and frankly outthought. Surrender now, and we'll discuss terms that don't involve demonstrating any more creative applications of your own technology against you. Santos? Kethvar turned to Maya. Admiral Santos. Maya's grin was barely visible behind the life support apparatus, but her eyes still sparkled with that unsettling intelligence. Did I forget to mention? The woman you've been holding prisoner for the last 6 hours is my sister. Captain Maya Santos, military engineer. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Elena Santos, Strategic Intelligence. You're not dying? Veltan whispered in horror. Oh, I'm definitely dying, Maya replied cheerfully. I have been for hours. But dying and non-functional are two completely different states of being. I've got maybe 10 more minutes before even human stubbornness can't keep me conscious. She gestured weakly at the chaos around them. Just enough time to finish the mission and watch you surrender to my big sister. Who, by the way, is absolutely going to gloat about this for centuries. Kethvar stared at the human who had single-handedly dismantled their entire fleet while technically being a corpse. Admiral Quintar, he said into his communicator, recommendation for future human encounters. Never, under any circumstances, tell them the odds of their survival. They will find a way to weaponize the remainder. Maya's final laugh echoed through the medical bay as the Zephyrian fleet formally surrendered to an enemy that had just taught them the most expensive lesson in galactic history. Never underestimate a species that considers a 2% survival chance to be adequate working conditions.